So first of all, some biographical information for those of you who don't know anything about Samuel Pepys, and I knew very little except that he was a diarist and that he seemed to have been fond of sort of jumping on servant girls, but there was a lot more to him than that. I mean, Samuel Pepys was a true Londoner. He was born in 1633, just off Fleet Street in Salisbury Court, above a tailoring shop. His father, John Pepys, was a tailor, and Pepys was one of 11 children born to that family, only 4 of whom lived to adulthood, and that was not unusual for the times. And Samuel ended up being the eldest child, and with 2 younger brothers and a younger sister called Pauline Paul, whom he really didn't take to. Anyway, so he grew up there. He went to school briefly in Huntingdon, and then he came back and went to St Paul's School, next to what was then the old cathedral, which burnt to the ground in the Great Fire, and he was at that school for some time. He lived in Seething Lane, overlooking or close to the Tower of London, for I think 13 years, or when he was working for the Navy Office in a rather grand house that belonged to the Navy. He's buried in St Olave's, which is, I believe, also very near Seething Lane. And he was frequently going up and down the river to Rotherhithe, to Bermondsey, to Greenwich, and beyond in his work for the Navy, where he was basically involved with all sorts of procurement and making sure the Navy weren't being fiddled. He was always learning about masts and rigging and such like. So that's just to give you his brief London connections. I'll start by reading a poem about his time at St Paul's School. Now, this was a school. There were 150 boys there, and they were all taught in the same large room. But there were 8 classes. You went when you were about 11, left 18-ish, and you moved up according to achievement and ability and not to do with age. So you could be in Form 2 when you were 18, or you could leapfrog up to the top class. And it was mainly classical learning that they did, a lot of Latin, writing Latin speeches, translation, etc. So let me see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else you need to know. Yes, I say at the end of this poem that he saw the first Charles executed, and although we don't know this for certain, it is extremely likely that he did. And at this time when he was at St Paul's School, he was an ardent Roundhead, a very sincere Puritan, although later in his life he served King Charles II and became a royalist. So, Pepys at St Paul's School. Butting shoulders with the sons of baronets, soap boilers and Bible thumpers, he was commanded from the high windows to either teach, study, or leave. Diligent, he dipped his head and sipped the clear, plain broth of Latin learning. Step by step he climbed the classes, neither scrabbling ahead nor slumping with the full-grown dunces. A stern Roundhead with no lace at his throat or royalist froth between his ears, his breath quickened when the new model army tramped into St Paul's Church, the horses clinking their bits, flanks creamed with sweat, blowing out their ribs with relief as they tugged at stalks of fragrant meadow hay brought in from Hackney's fields. He even wormed his way into Westminster Hall to view the king led onto a crimson velvet cloth, craned his neck round a prentice's sweaty shirt as Charles stepped onto the scaffold, heard the crowd's long groan run like ripples through water when the axe bit off the king's regal head and sent it tumbling down. Back in the school classroom, his pious words spread along the fidgety benches. The memory of the wicked shall rot. Years later, serving the next king, he kept his tongue tied, his lips pressed shut. So after he'd left St Paul's, he went up to Cambridge, where he got a scholarship, where he seems to have been a sort of average rather than an outstanding student, and he came back to London and started work as a clerk, which was basically a gopher for his wealthy cousin Edward Montague. And while he was gophering, he was a young man about town, he met Elizabeth, who was to be his wife. She was a beautiful and attractive young woman, and he was completely besotted, determined to marry her. And they did marry. She was just 15 when they married, and he was 22. And it was a completely daft thing to do, because neither of them had any money or anywhere to live. Well, they had his lodgings up in what he called his turret, his smoky turret in the Palace of Whitehall. And the marriage was volatile from the start. Huge rows, difficulties, not helped by the fact they both had medical problems, which perhaps I'll come on to in a second. So I decided to write a poem in the voice of Elizabeth, because one of the wonderful things about doing a collection of poetry is, of course, you can take on different voices and you can move between the different points of view. So this is Elizabeth on Samuel when they were first married. And she was half French and spoke beautifully in French as well as in English. My Sam could talk even then. Words flew out from his kiss-hungry lips like bright water from a pump. And he liked the talk in me even then. Begged me speak in French, tried to twist his own clever tongue around the Nouveau Testament. Between his brows he carried a smudge of worry, for there was never such a man for adding up his wealth and finding it wanting, even then. And he'd a temper, even then, that burst into words like mustard pus from a boil if he thought himself bested. Washed clean, he smelled of soap and almond oil, and when he sang, his mouth softened and filled with something other than himself. Did I love him? Not when he blacked my eyes. Then I left him to stew in the fumes of his own bloody water until his cogging brought me back, even then.
So in case, some of you won't know where that's being broadcast, that's on Radio 4, and it's part of the Women's Hour drama that goes out in the morning and is repeated in the evening. And this is our third year of doing Pepys, we do 3 Women's Hour a year. Next year will be a bit of an exception because it's the fire next year, so we're having a fire special. And I've just done The Plague, which I was sort of looking forward to doing until I actually stood inside the year. And of course, it's horrific, unbelievably horrific. A third of the population died in 1665. That was broadcast, I think, in September. And but what is extraordinary about it and what's indicative about Pepys, and I think one of the reasons why in the end I grew to like him so much, was that right the way through this tragic year with a third of the population dying, he says at least twice in his diary, "This is the best year I've ever had." And I think one of the reasons why I've sort of grown to like him so much is also his endearing relationship with his, and fiery and very contemporary relationship he has with his wife. And the heart of the diaries, and certainly the heart of dramatising them, is to really bring that to the full, because I think that is something that most of us can identify with. And certainly in the diaries, it looks really not that dissimilar to what happens now between men and women. It doesn't look to me like it's changed much. And she had a lot of say in the marriage, much more probably than women of the following century, certainly, I'd say. And certainly women could, there wasn't such a... There was less of an issue, I think, though it was dangerous to wander around London on their own, certainly there was less of an issue of being chaperoned, and compared to the following century, where it seems to me that the women become much more stepped upon. But there are other things about it. I really love the way that, for me, half of it is really recognisable and half of it isn't. It's as if we're going from a medieval period into something that we can recognise as now. And there are sort of bizarre things that I love about it, like you could take a piece of meat, a dead chicken or a piece of fish into a pub and they'd cook it for you. And I think that's a small thing, but to me that's another world away, that's a medieval world away. And people were hung, drawn and quartered and all that's going on, this extraordinary gore, which was your sort of big brother of the day, that's what people would go and watch. It was, and didn't seem to most people didn't seem to be affected by the horror of it. But you've also got other things which I really love, and again, the things that you can really relate to and apply to what the contemporary world now is, sort of the things that you really look for when you're dramatising it. And one of my favourite stories was, Pepys has this constant argument with interior decorators and builders inside his house, which again is terribly contemporary. He's forever doing up his house. And he gets these builders in, these local builders in, and they're drunk and unreliable and they don't turn up and they do terrible work there. And in the end, for all those reasons, he decides to get rid of them. And he decides to employ some foreigners to come in, and the foreigners are reliable, they turn up on time, they're never drunk, they do the work really consistently. And the citizens, as they're known, the people that he originally employed, find out that he's employed these foreigners, and that's the word he uses, foreigner. And they say that they're going to tell on him, and Pepys says, if you tell me, I'm going to tell everyone that I know what terrible workman you are, and he sort of gets away with it. And the foreigners, because you could only work inside the city limits at that time, citizens were the only people that could work inside in London in that period, and they had to live inside the parameters of the city. Foreigners are from Essex. But it's a gift, isn't it, to dramatise that? It's wonderful, and the life of Pepys is full of moments like that. He was also very, very funny, and there's one of my other favourite stories about him is when he had these rather irritating bosses to him, because he's not a posh boy, but he had a lot of these posh boy bosses that didn't really know very much about the Navy, certainly hadn't worked up and through the ranks like he had. And there's one called Sir William Penn, who particularly, William disliked both of them, was very catty about both of them, but I think disliked Penn more. He stole his favourite tankard, in effect his favourite mug, from the office. And he stole it for 3 months, and then persuaded William Penn that he'd found the thief that had stolen his mug, and that if he would pay him 30 shillings, which is quite a lot of money in that period, he can get it back for him. So William Penn pays Pepys, and the whole office knows this, that Pepys has stolen the tankard. And William Penn pays him 30 shillings and the mug is returned. And it's things like that which I think are wonderful. And things like he nailed down the carpets of his office, so no one could steal them. Because he's quite OCD, he's quite obsessive, really, in order, and which is why he revolutionises the Navy as well, and is perhaps arguably responsible for the success, or it certainly contributes to the success of our Navy in the following century, because he's such a brilliant administrator. And just a joy to spend time with, actually. I'm surprised about, once you can get over the womanising aspect of him, which is really, and also the fact that he is very violent. But a lot of the violence in that period is also to do with the fact that the water's not safe, so you drink alcohol, and some of you perhaps know this, and the first thing that you do in the morning is you go for your morning draft. So when you actually look at the course of the day, he's drinking from 11 o'clock onwards, and most of your business takes place in bars as well. So by the end of the day, they must have been really drunk on a mass level. And so I don't think, though I'm not justifying the violence in any shape or form, because obviously that's also part of the culture of that period that you're in, these people were drunk, most of them, as far as I can work out by the end of the day. Even though the alcohol was weaker, that must have been what was going on, certainly in Pepys's case anyway.